Welcome to our penultimate lecture in the Imago Dei lecture series. This is a series of lectures we put on about theological anthropology this term, and it's leading up to our summer conference on restoring the image of creation, salvation, and the human person. Please get a ticket to our summer conference if you haven't got one already, and if you're interested in coming, because we are almost sold out. We also have tickets available for those to access the live stream if you're not able to come in person. And we have various reduced price tickets and bursaries available for students as well. So please do look that up on our website. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Father Christopher Smith, who's a friend of the house for a long time, I think, and a friend of the principal as well. Father Christopher Smith is the vicar and parish priest of St. Albans Church in Holborn. And he's also almost come to the end of writing a doctorate on the thought of Eric Mascall, and that's why we are very pleased that we also have received these copies of Mascall's 3 books that have been reprinted by Anglo-Catholic Press. We will be selling the copies that we have left over at our conference, so if you want to buy one from us, please come to our conference. And that's all for me to say, and the title of Father Christopher's talk is The Importance of Being Human. So please join me in welcoming Father Christopher.
Well, thank you, members, and thank you all. It's good to be back in Pusey House, and I brought my cloth-bound edition of The Importance of Being Human, which is there. But there it is in this reprint by Anglo-Catholic Press. I mean, it is interesting that they've picked it up. And have picked up a number of Mascall's works. I'm delighted that they have. I'd love to know how come. I'd love to know what took them to Mascall, but there we are. Man has nothing, he is nothing, save what he has received as a pure gift from the one whose majesty he is powerless either to enhance or diminish. But just because of this gift, he has a rank among created beings which places him at their summit and enthrones him as their lord. This twofold nature of man involves a combination of humility and dignity which the modern world finds it hard to understand. All it can substitute for it is a diabolic parody compounded of insignificance and self-assertion. The 20th century man feels his essential nothingness and rebels against it. He feels his essential greatness and, acknowledging no higher power, he gives himself the credit for it. His only antidote for despair is pride, and by that sin fell the angels. Well, that's a quotation from a very early work of E.L. Mascall called Death or Dogma, which he wrote in 1937. In fact, it was his first published book. Man's loss of belief in God, he says, has led to a loss of belief in himself. He has this rather splendid phrase for that, the auto-debunking of man. The practice of religion, he reminds us, ought to be a training for the enjoyment of the beatific vision. Instead, modern man rebels against God by giving himself the credit for his greatness. The resolution can only come from God through the incarnation. What man could not do for himself, God has come to do for him. Actions speak louder than words, and that is consummately true of the redemption of the human race. God did not choose to save the world by talking about it. And I suppose this is theological anthropology, which you've been looking at in this series of lectures, a discipline which seems to have come to incorporate all sorts of things of which I am suspicious. But which we would once have seen as an attempt to answer, as Christians, the psalmist's question, what is man? So let's see what light Eric Mascall might shed on this matter, and we will go in the first place to the book that I waved at you at the beginning in its cloth covers, his American Bampton lectures from 1958. It is, as we shall see, important to try to understand what human nature is, both in its unfallen state, so that we might see what the true human nature taken by the word is, and in its fallen state, so that we might have some sense of what we are being redeemed from. The American Bamptons were published in Britain under that title, The Importance of Being Human. Mascall begins with a Christian perspective on evolution. Is it all the product of chance rather than design? Is man nothing more than the successful cosmic bandit, the character who, by a happy combination of good fortune and adroitness, has carved out for himself in the universe a position of prominence and affluence for which he can plead no official authorization or backing? It is not inconceivable that God has used chance as the means to arrive at the emergence of Homo sapiens, giving us a spiritual and immortal soul at the point at which we had become the being which could receive such a thing. And at the other end of that spectrum of argument, Mascall is also aware of the argument of the intelligent designer, although he believes that this is perhaps the product of a commercially minded age in the 1950s. The problem for those of a purely naturalistic outlook is that the whole universe is seen in impersonal terms. Quote, where the theist sees human life as an exhilarating adventure of human freedom played out under the fatherly oversight of divine providence, the secularist sees it as a grim domain of fate from which the only possible escape is provided by luck or chance. Mascall's conclusion at this point, then, is that evolutionary biology does not exclude the Christian understanding of man as, quote, the uniquely favoured creature upon whom God has stamped his own image. Indeed, Mascall posits that civilised Western man in the world of today, the 1950s, finds it difficult to conceive that he has any special assigned status in the universe. And that inevitably has a psychological impact, I think, in itself. And I was going to say look around you, but when you get outside, look around you and see. Or indeed that, quote, he is a being of definite and determinate nature at all. Quote, the doctrine of evolution introduced the notion that species are essentially mutable and made no exception in the case of man. So where does that leave us? Well, it's left many of us with the sense that we're merely one step up from the great apes, but equally not far away from sort of evolving into a new superhuman race. On the contrary, says Mascall, if the Christian religion is true, we have quite solid reasons for holding that whatever developments man is meant to undergo, and these may indeed be far-reaching, man is meant to remain man. For if God has himself become man in the incarnation, he has sealed human nature with a certificate of value whose validity cannot be disputed. That means that human nature is worthy of the utmost respect, even if human reason has been weakened by sin. It is in its unfallen state the nature taken by God at the incarnation and taken into the Godhead permanently on Ascension Day. The matter of the importance not only of human nature generally, but also of the body, also brings us back to a key theme of Mascall's, which is this point that Jesus did not discard his own body at the Ascension. The human body is therefore, quote, not merely an accidental and temporary integument meaning covering, for if God has united human nature to himself in its fullness of soul and body, and after undergoing physical death in that same human nature has returned to life again with his body transformed but not discarded, it is impossible to hold that the material element in human nature is either evil or irrelevant. But of course, emphasising the importance of the body does not invite the Christian to neglect the soul. And here Mascall defers to Father Lionel Thornton, CR, and his best-known work, The Incarnate Lord, which was published in 1928. We humans are not merely different in degree from the beasts, and to suggest that we are merely different in degree is to undermine the great biblical declaration that God has made us in his own image. Orthodox Christianity doesn't follow that Cartesian understanding of man as in, quote, in his essence a pure spirit whose inhabitation of a material body is a temporary and on the whole a tiresome episode, but neither is it, on the other hand, the view which would simply identify man with his body and see the soul as just the epiphenomenon of a highly developed physical organism. It is the view that man is a unique and highly complicated being composed of a body which is more elaborate than, though not necessarily different from, that of any of the primates, and a soul which, although it is itself a purely spiritual entity, is not the kind of spirit that can function fully and freely on its own, since it is made for the express purpose of animating that particular human body with which it is united. All that, of course, puts paid to what Mascall calls the polymorphous doctrine known as Manichaeism, that belief that matter is inherently evil, which can lead either to the conclusion that the body is an interfering and thwarting encumbrance on the soul and must therefore be crushed and bridled in the most ruthless way, or on the other hand, to the conclusion that since the body has a purely accidental relation to the soul cannot be seriously affected by anything that it does, and that therefore it may as well be allowed to do anything it likes, however beastly and disgusting, since the soul, which is the essential man, will be inherently unaffected. On the contrary, he would say, the Christian tradition holds that the body is part of the man, and that matter, no less than spirit, is created by God, and therefore needs neither to be crushed nor indulged, but to be sanctified. Human will, then, is a faculty of the soul, and the body is not evil, but capable of doing evil through the wrong decisions of the will. And that is why it was necessary for Christ to have a human will and a sinless one in order to redeem the source of sinfulness in man. And to be human is to have, as Mascall put it, a unique and exciting status in the universe, for it is to be a dweller in both the great realms of creation, the realm of matter and the realm of the spirit. And our human nature, including its physicality, has been adopted permanently by the second person of the Trinity, and thereby raised to a dignity that not even the angels have known. Quote, "There is certainly nothing that anyone need to be ashamed of in being a human being, but it is a task that calls for diligence, humility, and, in view of our fallen condition, for the grace of God. So a human being, quote, must be ready to live as the kind of being composed of spirit and matter that he actually is, in a right relationship to God, to his fellow men, and to the material earth which is the basis of his physical life. And in that context, we have the ability to take free and responsible decisions and to abide by their consequences, as Mascall put it, as God's vicegerent, bearing the seal of God's image, and so participate in a finite and relative way in the creative activity of God. So, let us look briefly at a work from 1956 of Mascall's Via Media. Look at his writing on creation, which he calls dependent reality, and grace, which he calls deified creaturehood. Just as an aside, I said I wasn't going to make any asides, didn't I? Just as an aside, it's quite interesting to see that people are picking up this book, which I thought was long forgotten. And I did notice that the Regius Professor of Divinity was brandishing a copy of it recently, so worth looking out for before they all go secondhand. The assumption of a Christian society is that, quote, the world depends for its existence on the creative act of a self-existent and omnipotent deity. Although that's not universally accepted, of course, once accepted, the problem becomes not whether the existence of the world necessarily implies the existence of a creator, but why, if there is a self-existent and self-sufficient God, he should create a world at all. I often wonder. We want to accept, contra Plato, that the created order is real as well as dependent, and contra atheism, that it is dependent as well as real. Creation is not to be looked upon as, quote, the manipulation of pre-existent material by a divine craftsman, nor is it any kind of process or change, but is, from the side of the creature, a relation of pure dependence. God exists in a state of pure self-sufficiency, and creation exists in a state of pure dependence. And it is only, quote, it is only when finite beings are recognized as dependent realities that we can wholeheartedly rejoice in them without danger of idolatry. The Christian attitude to creatures is neither to worship them for their own sake, is neither to worship them for their own sake, nor, on the other hand, to treat them with contempt, in order, by contrast, to extol the glory and perfection of God. Sin has distorted God's world, but in their ontological depth, creatures are contrasted with God not by being sinful, but by being finite. And to pass from the finite to the infinite, we have not to depress the finite, but to surpass it. And if the created order is a thing of beauty and wonder, how much more must the beauty and loveliness be of God himself? Having said all that, we must now consider the remarkable fact, says Mascall, that in spite of its insistence upon the radical and indestructible difference of kind that distinguishes the Creator from even the most exalted of his creatures, there is a persistent tradition in Christian thought which finds it impossible to do justice to the transformation that a human being undergoes when he is incorporated into Christ, except by saying that he is deified. But even though, as St. Augustine put it, God became man in order that we might become God, that transformation takes place without the destruction of our creaturely status. Man is not changed into the substance of God, hence the deified creaturehood of Mascall's chapter title. But the terminology implies a real participation in God. And Mascall there is hinting at St. John of the Cross. He made wrote a very early book on St. John of the Cross, and his devotion to St. John of the Cross is quite interesting and worth exploring, I think. Mascall's deified creaturehood is, quote, distinct from those doctrines on the one side which would allow for such an entative transformation into the divine substance as would result in the loss of creaturehood altogether, and from those doctrines on the other side which hold that creaturehood is inherently incapable of deification. Human nature, then, having been Christified as a result of the incarnation, is fit for unity with the human nature retained by Christ himself. Grace perfects nature without destroying it, and grace, I'm expecting you to join in as I go along, and grace requires nature as its presupposition. Because man has a potentia obedientalis for the supernatural order, he is able, unlike any other creature, to be raised by God, as it were, Mascall means above his own level, to be raised by God to the enjoyment of God himself. Grace is thus not merely something added to nature as an extra story might be added to a house, but something that completes and perfects it. Supernature is neither contrary to nature nor indifferent to it, rather it is nature's fulfilment. So, says Mascall, the whole possibility of man's deification depends upon two facts. The first is the fact that God is incessantly active as creator at the ontological root of every creature, maintaining it in existence by, as it were, continually pouring his goodness into it. The second is the fact that man, as a rational and responsible being, is made, as no lower creature is, in the image of God. If we hold a deistic view of creation, we shall think of creatures as encapsulated in their finitude, in such a way as to make them incapable of receiving anything more than purely external manipulation by God. He can push them about, but he cannot bring about any inner transformation in them. At least he cannot do this without destroying their natures and making them into other beings than they are. But being finite is not the same as being finished. To be dependent is to be incomplete. And to be incomplete is to depend on God's incessant activation, without which we would cease to be. To be a finite being is to be essentially open, says Mascall, open to the activity of God, who, without annulling or withdrawing anything that he has given, can always give more. And the type of perfectibility of which human beings are capable is dependent on the fact that we are made in the image of God, and to be made in God's image is to be capable of possessing God's life. The finite is capable of infinity. This, quote, does not mean that a man can raise himself to the possession of God by his own powers, but it does mean that he can be raised to it by God, and that if he is so raised, all his natural powers will thereby be enriched and ennobled. And the greatest example of this, as Mascall puts it, interpenetration of the finite by the infinite, is of course to be found in the incarnation. And we, who are many, are united with the divine person through the activity of grace. It is, as the angelic doctor put it, that the incarnation puts the finishing touch to the whole vast work envisaged by God. For man, who was the last to be created, returns by a sort of circulatory movement to his first beginning, being united by the work of the incarnation to the very principle of all things. This all goes to explain why the last to be created being is, as we saw, no mere superior grade of mammal, and more than a spirit temporarily housed in a body which may be viewed either as a nuisance or a plaything, but in any case is something that the human being has rather than part of what he is. Human beings are capable of reflection and abstraction and forming from contemplation of the finite world around us, as Mascall put it, the notion of a self-existent, infinite spirit upon whom the world of our experience depends. In man, therefore, we see incorporated in the material realm a spiritual factor which, bearing upon itself the image of God, can recognise God as the archetype and imprinter of that image, and can raise the material realm itself to the level of spirit. Which is to say, each human being is a bipartite organism of body and soul. Man is, as Mascall said, the featherless biped who stalks the earth dreaming fantastic dreams and seeking the fulfilment of preposterous desires, conscious of itself, and not only of itself, but also of the spirit who made it and preserves it. This, says Mascall, is complicated enough, this union of body and soul, but it is further complicated by the individual human being's relation to society, this dual character of individuality and sociality that is implied when we describe the human being as a person. And the very concept of personality only reveals its full content and implications when the Church starts thrashing out its understanding of the nature of God. Mascall's point, drawing in part on an essay by Jacques Maritain, is that whilst individuality is the material marker of one person against any other, personality is rooted in the soul. And God is supremely personal because he is the supreme reality. And Mascall goes on to test the idea that as well as existing on the frontier where matter and spirit overlap, human nature is also the place where the created and the uncreated overlap, man having been made in the image of God and partaking of the divine nature. What, he asks, is involved in the fact that man is a rational creature? The answer in the first place is what Mascall elsewhere called the openness of being, the fundamental openness of human nature to God's activity. Why is human nature open to God's activity? Because a nature that is already supernaturalized, a nature given by God and taken by God, is capable of being further supernaturalized. And this openness to God is, quote, the metaphysical basis of the Catholic doctrine of the elevation of man's nature to the level of supernature by grace. And as the process goes on, the creature finds its own activity not bypassed or suppressed, but on the contrary, liberated and enhanced. The more it is supernaturalized, the more truly natural it becomes. And all this because openness to God is of its very essence. Dependence on him is part of its definition. And this relationship, this is a relationship based more on simple dependence, mere dependence, but on what Mascall called a vital union of life and love between a personal creature and its personal creator. So let us turn with Mascall to the sad condition in which we find ourselves, to the question of how it is that humanity comes to need redeeming at all, and how it comes to be that human nature needs to be redeemed by human nature. And Mascall addresses the problem by setting it in a broader context. Quote, "Only God is infinite, every creature is of necessity finite, and it is finite in some particular kind of way. It is a perfectly good thing for a dog to be a dog, for a man to be a man, for an angel to be an angel. It is in fact a perfectly good thing for a creature to be a creature. If, however, a creature is stupid enough not to be satisfied with the sort of being that he is, and in particular if it is not satisfied with being a creature, everything is far from well. And in fact, it is just this last kind of dissatisfaction which the Christian tradition sees as being the ultimate cause of evil in the genuine and serious sense of the word. And Mascall restates the traditional Christian understanding that evil arises from sin in the angelic world, in the very summit of created order, the realm of beings of perfection, albeit finite perfection. For such a being, it would appear, I'm quoting, for such a being, it would appear only two kinds of self-vitiation are fundamentally possible. Contemplating its own splendour, it may rebel against receiving this splendour from another, or it may pretend to itself that it does not receive it from another at all. That is to say, it may either rebel against being subject to God, or deny that it is subject to him. Thus, the radical sin of the fallen angels is pride. Any other sins, such as disobedience, of which they are guilty, follow upon it and are included in it. It flows from this, Mascall says, that sin in essence is an attempt to undo the creative act of God, in that by denying its dependence on God, a creature is attempting to undo its own createdness, without which it would cease to exist, but which thing is impossible for the creature, and God in his mercy refuses to endorse the creature's denial. Quote, all it can do, is delude itself into the belief that it possesses a self-existence and a self-sufficiency which it does not in fact possess. Its denial of the truth can corrode both the intellect and the will, but it cannot penetrate to the ontological root, where it draws its very existence from the creative activity of God. And Mascall goes on to reflect on the implication in the doctrine of the cosmic fall that some sense of the consequence of sin predates humanity, that the world seems to have got badly out of joint before man arrived in it. This explains the strong sense in the first century that the world had fallen under the control of malevolent cosmic powers, and of which we read in the letters of St. Paul and in certain works of mystical theology. And it is a fallen spirit, of course, whom Jewish and Christian tradition alike has alighted on as the tempter of the first human beings, as Mascall says in Christ the Christian and the Church. What precisely was the nature of the sin which Genesis describes as the eating of the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it may be difficult to determine, but the outcome is clear. Man is no longer able to speak with God face to face, as God walks in the garden in the cool of the day. There is no change in God, the change is in man. And so human beings lose their true likeness in the fall, having been made in the image and likeness of God, and so we suffer a loss of unity within ourselves, as St. Paul knows when he speaks to the Romans of his propensity to sin. You remember, I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. We all know how he feels. And Mascall tells us that, quote, the disintegration is repaired through union with Christ, for in him the likeness of perfect manhood is unspoilt, and the Christian character is nothing less than the character of Christ progressively communicated to his members. For Christ is the Father's own image, and in this image and likeness man was made. Loss of unity, then, is helpful for explaining the transmission of original sin. Quote, for no mechanism is needed to explain the absence of something. It is presumably original righteousness rather than original sin that would require a mechanism for transmission. And since the fall, that mechanism is no longer there. Chew on that. And there are implications of the fall not only in the moral sphere but also in the physical, and Mascall touches on that in Christian theology and natural science. An unfallen race would have possessed a body like that of the transfigured and ascended Lord. Quote, From this point of view, then, man's mortality and his liability to physical disease are consequences of his failure to make that joyous and loving acceptance of the will of his Creator in which he would have found not only spiritual and mental, but also physical beatitude. Mascall also asks whether the angelic sin manifested in the temptation by the serpent, quote, introduced into the material realm a disorder which has manifested itself in a distortion of the evolutionary plan. Mascall concedes that the matter may be more than usually obscure. In The Importance of Being Human, he also considers the matter of whether the sin recorded in Genesis, be it interpreted as mythological or historical, should be regarded as allegorical of human sin generally, or of the first sin in particular. It seems to Mascall that, quote, the first human sin has an absolutely pivotal and catastrophic character simply because it is the first. For unless there was a previous fall on the part of rational corporeal beings in some part of the universe to us unknown, it constitutes the first occasion on which the material part of the universe has contravened God's will for it and thus violated the law of its own being by action originating from within itself. And in any case, it constitutes the first such occasion emanating from within the realm of man. Like a microscopic crack in a china vase, it initiated a process of disintegration and corruption whose consequences spread far beyond the area of their origin and affected the whole subsequent history of the human race and of the material realm. Microscopic crack in a china vase. It's a good preaching point, I always think. Perhaps more importantly, from the Christological point of view, Mascall goes on to consider the primary effect of Adam's fall as the breaking of unity. Quote, the breaking of Adam's own unity with God and the weakening of the unity which would otherwise have bound him and his descendants together in an organic body and have bound that organic body in union with God. And that fundamental breach remains even when individual good acts tend towards its repair, while bad acts will weaken the unity still further. Quote, when original sin, to use the technical term, is seen in this way, the problem of the mechanism of its transmission, which has so much worried theologians, evaporates. No special means of transmission is needed other than human nature itself, just as no medium is needed for the transmission of the crack other than the material of the vase. Even so, in spite of all this, sin cannot destroy the ontological contact between creature and creator. Mascall would say that human beings do have value even having fallen, and not been redeemed, and that the inherent value derives solely from God. Sin does not consist in recognising one's value and indeed rejoicing in it. The sin lies in refusing to recognise its source and so give glory to its creator. God, even so, maintains his creation in existence and, quote, provides the foundation for the further act by which God can reorient it towards himself. We can make progress, even though it is slow. And the doctrine of original sin is therefore what Mascall calls a thoroughly cheerful doctrine. Quote, for it enables us to look the facts in the face without losing hope. It assures us that the sad condition in which we find ourselves is not the condition for which we were made, and that by the grace of God we can be delivered from it. So, let me finish, having got us to our fallen state, with the mechanism for getting us out of it. In the final chapter of The Importance of Being Human, Mascall opens up a discussion on the consequences of the incarnation by going to that controversy which you will all have enjoyed between Scotists and Thomists as to whether, had there been no fall, there would have been an incarnation. Always an entertaining pub game, I think. The reason the followers of Duns Scotus gave for taking the view that there would have been was that the incarnation ought not to be contingent upon what Mascall calls so squalid and in the last resort unnecessary an event as the fall. The incarnation, as both sides agreed, has not only redeemed man, but has also provided the means of his supernaturalization. So, except in those rare instances alluded to earlier, quote, the covenanted and public vehicle of grace is the human nature taken by God the Son, and furthermore, that this dispensation on the part of God is coherent and congruous with the essentially social nature of man. There is, says Mascall, no ultimate contradiction between the omniscience of God and the freedom of man. The infinite can contain the finite without the infinite being changed or the finite being destroyed. Even so, the incarnation is the supreme example of the supernaturalization of nature by grace. And God became man not simply in order to honour mankind, which would be to force the logic of the Scotist position, but to perfect and elevate and heal it. Without losing our creaturely status, we become sharers in the life of God. And in the incarnation, God was not concerned in the first place to vindicate his own dignity, but to rescue man from the consequences of his malice and obstinacy. Again, to go back to Lionel Thornton, and Lionel Thornton was writing, as Mascall quotes him here, on the development of Pauline thought on this matter in the writings of St. Irenaeus. Mascall pursues the line that, in Thornton's words, creation and redemption are parts of a single plan. Thus, when, by birth from a human mother, God the Son, who is Adam's creator, becomes as man one of Adam's descendants, he recreates and restores the human race. Quoting Thornton, Adam is the whole to which all men belong, and Christ is the whole to which all are transferred by inclusion of Adam in Christ. And so we return to the idea that of the incarnation restoring the unity broken at the fall, the unity which is part of the original created order. Quote, the unity of man with God, the unity of man with man, and the unity of man with himself. This unity is re-established and reintroduced when the Creator, becoming man by birth from a human mother, refashions upon his own figure the substance of fallen man. In his own individuality, this refashioning is complete. He is the perfect man, the totally obedient Son of the Father, and in his individual manhood, he makes to the Father that perfect offering which Adam had failed to make. Here we encounter the idea of perfect filiality, the perfect filiality which the second person has by virtue of his relationship with his Father, which Adam could not have had even had he not fallen. Quote, in Jesus of Nazareth, then, manhood is restored to sonship by being raised to a sonship that it never had before. Nature is perfected by being supernaturalized. And so the human race is, quote, bathed in and infused with the radiance that streams from the human nature of the incarnate Lord. And as if being bathed in it were not enough, we are able to be incorporated into that human nature, made filii in filio, by baptism into the church. Quote, thus, in the Christian church, the body of Christ, mankind has recovered the unity that it lost in Adam and has indeed been granted a more wonderful and interior unity than it had lost. And so the missionary endeavour as we go into the world becomes, in a sense, an evolutionary one. Human evolution is now evolution within the body of Christ. Quote, that is to say, the progressive incorporation of the human race into the sacramental church and the development and use of all man's newly won powers under the growing influence of supernatural grace. And while Mascall in no way commends what he calls a retreat from the hard realities of the 20th century, good job he didn't live to see the 21st, really, Mascall maintains that, quote, the supreme social service which the church can perform and one which can be performed by no other agency, is the living of the Church's life as the redeemed sacramental community in the midst of a civilization whose activities, whether beneficent or harmful, are for the most part organised for entirely secular ends. For the grace which is mediated through the sacramental activity of the body of Christ is not limited in its objects and its effects by the Church's visible boundaries. The work of the Church, in that phrase which I particularly love of Mascall's, overflows its own boundaries and irrigates the surrounding land, claiming all God's creation as his possession. That perhaps is a place to finish, but let me just do so by saying Mascall goes on to remind his readers that whatever we may claim for the Church, that's not to suggest that her members are free from fault, since, quote, when a man is incorporated into Christ, that is the beginning of his sanctification, not its end. And as he said in Corpus Christi, it is the inner reality of the Church which we are addressing here, in which the Son of God patiently and tenderly draws men and women into his own perfect nature and offers them to the Father as his members, made one with him and clothed with his glory. This is actual Christian anthropology, the doctrine of man. Quote, "It is because Jesus is still man, though glorified by his resurrection and ascension in a way that we can hardly conceive, that men and women can be incorporated into his human nature today, and that the Church is truly, and not by a vague and inexact metaphor, the body of Christ." Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have about 30 minutes now for Q&A, and I'd like to ask the first one, if I may. You mentioned earlier the question of why it is that Angelica Press has reprinted these books by Mascall.
Could be because they're good.
Well, of course. Well,
but I'd be fascinated to know who's put them onto it.
Of course.
Do you know?
I don't. No. But I know that E.L. Mascall is often described as being an Anglican Thomist. But why, in your view, should we read Mascall today and not simply go back to Aquinas himself?
I think. Yeah, I mean, always take it from the horse's mouth if you like. But I mean, the line I would take on Mascall is that that he slightly got saddled with that that tag of an Anglican Thomist, and that his theological interests are very wide ranging. And yes, I mean he does. I mean you see it coming through all of that sort of first principles stuff. But he does a lot more than just do his thinking through St. Thomas Aquinas. I think there's a lot of sort of fascinating synthesis, but also original thought in Mascall, and so I would resist. I don't want to resist Anglican Thomists because he was, but there's more than that implies, shall we say? Just read it. Read the stuff.
Wonderful.
That's end of questions. Read the stuff. I would say on the subject of questions, if you've got sometimes people say that's a statement, not a question. I know if you want to make a comment, then make a comment. It doesn't matter. Don't feel you have to shoehorn it into a question. Would you agree that? I've done it on General Synod.
Well, questions? Yes, go ahead.
How would you polemically locate this presentation of the doctrine of man that you set forth? Maybe what would be your favorite polemical target that you have in mind as you read these words?
A polemical target of our times, or I mean Mascall,
or maybe within systematic theology, because we've heard lots of presentations of the doctrine of man or theological anthropology, and his presentation is unique amongst what we've heard this term, in its clarity, for instance. But how would?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think, you know, Mascall read, I mentioned Death or Dogma, which is the first published work. That was a Lent course. You know, it was in his, he was curator, his second curator was St Matthew's, Westminster, and he kind of did it as a Lent course. I think Mascall he did regard him, he says as much in Saraband, as a parish priest who became an academic by accident, rather than an academic who was, you know, for instance, ordained on his fellowship or, you know, whatever it might be. You know, he was only ever in 2 parishes and they were his curacies, and then he went to teach at Lincoln Theological College. But I think he regarded sort of becoming an academic as rather an accident, and he writes what he conceives of. I mean, it's inconceivable now, but he writes for the common reader. He writes for the person in the pew, or that's his self perception, I think. And so when and this is more the sort of second half of his career, by which time he's at King's College London, when he writes those books that push back against John A.T. Robinson and John Hick and you know, all that secularization of Christianity, Jesus, who he is and how we know him, that was sort of pushing back against Don Cupid and Sea of Faith, you know, all that consort. You know, he's doing that because he thinks, well, you know, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? You know, somebody needs to push back against this. People are sort of hearing this and becoming confused. You know, John A.T. Robinson, let us not forget, was a bishop, was Bishop of Woolwich. So those are his, you know, those are his polemical targets in the second half of his career, and I think there is a sort of clarity and lucidity about his writing. You know, whether the common reader today, you know, but well, I'll leave that sentence unfinished because it's not fair to make assumptions. But you know, that I do think that the sort of Robin, you know, myth of God incarnate stuff, all that, it has a long tail. It's a beast with a long tail, I think. You know, although you don't hear it explicitly stated in quite the sort of, you know, well, I mean, Robinson had a column in the Daily Mirror, didn't he? You know, you know, that's not happening anymore. But I think that sort of take it or leave it attitude to fundamentals of Christian doctrine is still sort of with us around the periphery, and that I think is you know, what drew me to Mascall as a preacher and a parish priest. Really, you know, there's a fabulously deep well there to draw, I think, in preaching and teaching in parish life, and that's. So my poor congregation, of course, you know, sit there in the course of the sermon waiting for the inevitable quotation from Aaron. And they very kindly don't roll their eyes and take out the paper. And, you know.
Any other questions? Good.
Comment first, since you invited it. As someone who sits in the pew, I would agree that say Corpus Christi and Christ the Christian Church are sort of written in that idiom, because I could read them and understand them fairly easily, but I wouldn't necessarily say that about openness and meaning or some of the more philosophical works, which I struggle with.
Yes, that's right, he who is.
So kind of maybe building a little bit on Ben's question, I was going to sort of ask, like, what conversation was he joining? But since you answered that, it'd be more like, what sort of pushback did he get? Since it's hard to find secondary literature.
Yeah, there isn't. Wait for my
I've looked, and for some of the things I'm working on, and
there isn't. There isn't.
It's almost like his pushback was just obscurely.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are a million and one ways to be unorthodox, aren't there? And you know, teach the Orthodox Christian faith, and you know, you don't generate the interest, do you? You don't shock. And I think Mascall's punishment for remaining orthodox was not to be taken apart. I just think they didn't really bother. You know, he wouldn't join the sort of what was then the modern theological establishment, the Ninehams and the Lamps, and you know, his horror at the fact that both the Regius professors of divinity in both universities were, you know, Unitarian, basically. But that was, that was what it was. That, I'm sure that isn't true of the Regis Professor now.
Well, I don't think so. Any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that it's not true of the Regis Professor now. Is that because things are better?
I don't teach in this university, so I just sort of bumble along in my own sweet way as a parish priest, reading a bit and trying my best to teach the people of God. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, there are some. It would be interesting to have a conversation, not on camera, about who's teaching and how in this university and others. And you will know much more about that. In fact, you probably almost all will know more about that than I do. So when he's turned the camera off, we can have that discussion. I'd be very interested to hear what you say.
Who were the Regis Professors during?
It was Lamp and Lynham.
Lamp and Lynham.
You could do bishops rather than Regis Professors, but that might be a camera off.
That would also be a camera off one. Yeah, but you can have the rest of the evening on that.
Did Mascall write much about technology? Because when people talk about theological anthropology, they're often today talking about AI, and all the different problems that technology is causing us today. Did he write much on technology himself in his work?
Well, that's a fair question. I mean, I don't know about technology, but but about sort of modern scientific things, particularly in biology. So one of the last books, the green one as opposed to the red one, which is Whatever Happened to the Human Mind. He's talking about chromosomes and that sort of area of biology about which I know nothing and won't pretend to. So he's engaged with the science. I mean, he was a mathematician. He was senior wrangler in the University of Cambridge, whatever that means. But he was a mathematician, and there is a scientific mind at work there, definitely. Yeah.
Any other questions? Would you mind mentioning what exactly you're working on in relation to Mascall's work? It would be interesting to hear it in this particular place.
I was asking the question, why did Jesus heal?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, if the death and resurrection and say ascension are kind of where the money is, what role did all this pre-passion life play, particularly healing?
His public ministry.
Yeah. And so last summer I was reading Corpus Christi, and in a section in there he has a section on the sacrifice of Christ. That was very interesting to me, and I thought something I hadn't come across before, namely that we all think of the sacrifice of Christ as being the cross, the blood of Christ. And he says that the sacrifice of Christ really begins in the Trinity, in what he calls the eternal filial oblation of the Son to the Father, and that's what true sacrifice looks like, the true giving of the self completely. And so then he includes the entire incarnational sweep of Christ's life in the sacrifice of Christ, and from the incarnation through to the session. And so that, to me, just kind of gave me an answer to that question. It's part of his eternal filial oblation of the Son, part of the sacrifice.
And he draws on all those theologians in the Francophone world, doesn't he? And I think it's a very interesting thing about Mascall in an English-speaking world which is sort of enthralled to German liberal theologians. Mascall is interested in the French and Belgian Catholics, and that I think that certainly shapes that particular part of Corpus Christi. But you see it. He's interested in Jean Gallo. He writes a lot about him in Theology of the Gospel of Christ. If I were a Roman Catholic, I would be desperate to explore Gallo
And maritime as well, I presume.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I drew on a French theologian, Eugene Mazur.
Yeah.
Wrote a book called The Christian Sacrifice. Really good reading. That'd be good one to preach on as well.
In French.
But that's what led me to these questions about who was interacting with. So I can't find anybody who's even interacted with that definition of the sacrifice of Christ.
Yes, I mean, I found myself, digging up book reviews and things like that. There's a very revealing book review by Keith Ward of Warner, which tells you more about Ward than it tells you about myself.
So I think that points out something that is sort of very striking about reading Mascall is how much of a unity he can make of things. Not by compressing things that are different into one, but by taking it all as part of a pattern, where the pattern works itself out appropriately in each different thing, perhaps. So, there's sacrifice. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing at each level, but you can see the same pattern at each level, or you can see the fact that each level is part of a greater pattern. I read a bit of Mascall, but not that much. So my question, I think, is you could see that as leading to him saying much the same thing every time. So do you think he says much the same thing at every time? And do you think he changes his mind about anything important over the course of his life?
A lot of people say the same thing. Of whom was it said, and by whom? What's the title of so-and-so's book this time? Same book, different title.
Not that it would be a problem.
I think it would be. I think it would be hard on Mascall to say that, but there is a degree of. I mean, if you're stating and restating the Orthodox Christian faith, as I say, and I'm channeling the man himself. Really, there are an infinite number of ways of being wrong, but only one way of being right. And so, if you're continually seeking to express Orthodox Christian doctrine, in response to a particular context, then inevitably you will. I mean, he does. I mean, a classic way he sort of reconsiders his position, but don't press me on the exact details of it. Is to do with his thinking on the beatific vision. He's quite interesting on that, and he sort of rewrites himself in one of the last books. So there is movement. Self-confessed movement.
Any other questions? Well, we can draw things to a close now. So please join me in thanking our speaker.
What time is it?
5:30. I think that's probably 6:15.
Oh no,
Okay.
I might not put myself through.
Sure. Okay.
I might go much of my briefing when I can.
Very good. Very good.
And
by the way, if you took me, I would like to please let me know. Because, I don't know.